Hello, everybody. This is Dave Anderson, a senior policy fellow at the Wisconsin Institute for Public Policy and Service in Wausau, otherwise known as WIPPS.
Hi, Dave. I'm Eric Giordano, the executive director of WIPPS. Very good to be here for another episode of Two Bald Guys. Dave, why don't you tell us a little bit about WIPPS?
Sounds good, Eric. Founded in 2007, WIPPS is a unit of the University of Wisconsin system with a mission to educate and engage citizens, develop future leaders, and help communities address issues that they care about.
So last week, we made the decision to forego our usual shorter format to try to address in a more meaningful way the tragedy of George Floyd's death and subsequent protests that have swept the nation. We had two really excellent guests, Dave, and for our viewers who didn't get a chance to check it out, I recommend you take a look at that show. Very informative. You can see that recorded at WIPPS.org/TBG. That's WIPPS.org/TBG. Now, another major issue is headlining in the aftermath of the George Floyd incident, and that's policing in America. And to address this topic today, we will stick with the longer format for today's show. And we'll be engaging two guests in a conversation with some prepared questions. However, if you're joining us live via Facebook, you are certainly welcome to post a question, and you can do that in the Facebook chat session. Our producer, Luke Rudolph, whom we greatly appreciate, will let us know if there's a question, and then that will be shared with our guests. Now, we can't promise that we'll get to all the questions, so I hope you'll be understanding of that reality. But if you have comments about our show that you want us to think about, or suggestions for future show ideas or guests, we gladly receive those at info@wipps.org. Now, frankly, Dave, I can't think of a more pivotal moment in our history in terms of the impact of a single event that's, on our society and public policy since 9/11. I mean, this has really been incredible.
I think you're right, Eric. And you watch the news every night, and this is an issue that really has captured the attention, I think, of the broad swath of America. And I think it's something that people are paying attention to. And to highlight that, as well as to introduce our topic today, let me share the results of a recent national survey that says, in the wake of the George Floyd incident, 69% of Americans say George Floyd's killing represents a broader problem within law enforcement, compared with fewer than 29% who say it was an isolated incident. This is really a remarkable shift in public opinion when compared to the reactions in 2014 to police killings of an unarmed black man in Ferguson, Missouri, and in New York. At that time, 43% of Americans described those deaths as indicative of a broader problem in policing, while 51% saw them as isolated incidents.
Right. I mean, that's a huge opinion shift virtually overnight, and certainly can explain why there's been so much, social media coverage, as well as obviously regular news coverage, and also tremendous bipartisan talks and statements about reforms. So that without further ado, let's get right to our guests, Dave, if you wouldn't mind introducing them.
Oh, absolutely. And it's our pleasure to introduce today Mr. Jim Palmer. Jim Palmer is the executive director of the Wisconsin Professional Police Association. In addition to serving as the organization's chief executive, he is also the WPPA spokesperson, chief legal counsel, and chief lobbyist. Jim currently serves on several national and state governing boards, including the National Association of Police Organizations and the National Law Enforcement Officers Memorial Fund. Welcome, Jim.
Thank you.
And I'd now like to introduce our second guest, Ben Bliven, who's the chief of police for the city of Wausau, and he has served in law enforcement for more than 21 years. Ben also serves on several boards, including the Wisconsin Police Executive Group and the North Central Chiefs of Police Association. Welcome, Chief Bliven, and we're going to dive right in with our first question for you.
Okay.
Shortly after the George Floyd incident, you took the unusual step of posting a statement on social media about issues of race and policing, in which you expressed personal frustration and outrage. Why don't you tell us a little bit about your message? And why do you think the George Floyd incident sparked so much personal outrage here in the United States, around the world, and frankly, right here in the city of Wausau.
You bet. Well, I think there's been a lot of incidents that have risen to the national landscape in terms of, race relations in law enforcement in our country. And, I've been in law enforcement long enough to know that a lot of times when we see a video that's recorded and put out on social media or in mainstream media, that generally there's a lot of context that we don't know when we see that video. And I know that from our experience in law enforcement. And so I think that's why a lot of times there isn't law enforcement from around the country talking about some incidents immediately in the aftermath of seeing a video, because we understand that typically there's context that we don't know that's important to know before coming to a decision on the use of force that we see in that video. In this case, the way I looked at the video was I tried to think about what possible context could there be that would justify the use of force that we saw used on George Floyd, and I couldn't come up with any. It was very clear that the use of force was excessive, and it led to the death of George Floyd and criminal charges for Derek Chauvin, and rightfully so. So I think that, that's how I evaluated that situation. And in the aftermath of George Floyd's death, there was a lot of questions and concerns in our community about what does, the local law enforcement think about, and how do we feel about what happened there in Minneapolis? Every police department is different. Every sheriff's department is different. Our philosophy and my philosophy is transparency as much as possible. We're very upfront and engaging our community, and so I felt like I owed it to our community to let them know how I felt and how I viewed that video, and especially I owed it to our minority community who are questioning police tactics and questioning things like George Floyd's death. So I felt it was very important for me to let them know where I stood on that.
Jim,
If I could just
if I could
just dovetail off the chief's remarks, and we put out a statement immediately, shortly after the tragic death of George Floyd as well, and we felt it was important to share with people that just as the chief said, we typically, as a statewide association, don't comment on public videos for all the reasons that the chief indicated. Obviously, this one was different, and every officer with whom I've spoken, and we represent more than 10,000 members across the state, had it affected them in a very deep and genuine way, and it was very impactful. And I mean, they had a visceral reaction just from the human perspective. I mean, what we saw in that video, it just desecrated the basic notions of human decency. But then, from a professional standpoint, it was offensive to them. It was an affront to the professionalism with which they try to carry out their duties on a daily basis. And it's important to I think to make the point that it's not representative of the law enforcement community here. I think statistically it's true that it's a fraction of the police engagements that actually result in any use of force. Having said that, relating it back to your point about the public perception, as it relates to policing in America, public perception matters. And, law enforcement relies upon having the trust of the public they serve, and that keeps them safe and allows them to do their jobs. And so clearly, you've seen, a unison of voices throughout the country and throughout the state that are, demanding a call for change, and we need to be sensitive to that.
Jim, I think you told me in an earlier conversation that, and you said you represent about 10,000 police officers. I think you said it was about 300 police departments or cities. Can you? Yeah,
from just over 300 local associations. Yes.
Oh, 300 locals. Thank you. Okay, so that's a lot of police officers around the state of Wisconsin. What are you seeing in terms of what the national picture looks like and what's happening with protests, in other parts of the country versus what you're seeing in Wisconsin communities? And then Ben, if you comment about what you're seeing locally in Wausau, we'd appreciate it. How does it compare or contrast, I guess?
Certainly, I think it seems pretty clear that the vast majority of protests nationally even have been peaceful, and there have been a few places such as Madison and Milwaukee where they have been a little more violent and more destructive, and in other places around the country we've seen that as well. But for the most part, these protests have been peaceful. But in the places where they have been destructive, it really represents a challenge for the officers who are often outnumbered. And who have to, kind of thread a very delicate needle in terms of, taking some amount of enforcement action, but not to the point of escalating these incidents. And so, again, I think it's clear that for the most part, those engaging in the protests and those, engaging in some of the more destructive behaviors tend to be different groups of people. I'm sure there's some crossover, but at least that's what we've seen in Milwaukee and in Madison in particular.
Thanks, Ben. What did you see in Wausau with regard to protests?
Yeah, well, there's actually been a number of different protests that have occurred here in Wausau. A couple of weeks ago, there was a protest near the courthouse in Wausau, organized by Black Lives Matter, and there were a few hundred people in attendance there. And it was very peaceful. I was happy to have the opportunity to go out there and talk with some of the folks from our community to try and understand what their experience locally has been with law enforcement, but also in terms of just living in our community. And I think that understanding is really important. That's work we've been trying to do for a number of years now. And it's work that we have a long ways to go in Wausau and I think around our state and country in terms of building those relationships. The larger protest occurred last week Saturday, and I feel I was really grateful that the organizers of that protest reached out to the police department, asked us to be involved in the planning of the event, so that we could help them and support them in their in supporting their First Amendment rights to peaceably assemble and protest. And it was, I think, the largest protest that we've seen in Wausau, and definitely in my time here. And we had maybe 1,500 people that marched, and it was really impactful. And again, I got the opportunity to have conversations with people that otherwise might not have engaged in discussions with me, come to my office, or met me for coffee or that kind of thing. So it was a good experience. It was peaceful. It's what I expected from our community. It's what I know our community here to be. And I know that we locally have a lot of work to do, and we are committed to doing that work.
Great, appreciate that. One little small note, I heard that the police are actually giving away water bottles to the protesters. That seemed like a really, to me, to sum up in a small way, the spirit of that event. Are we seeing, Jim, in other parts of the state, police departments that are sort of taking that collaborative approach or at least a non-confrontational approach?
I believe that we are. There are places where, the agencies have the ability to help support the rights of people to express their views and exercise their First Amendment rights. We have seen that. Obviously, some of the reactions of law enforcement agencies from elsewhere around the country which haven't been as constructive or productive. Have drawn national media attention, but that hasn't at least really been the experience here in this state.
Okay, thank you. Now let's switch gears just slightly. There's clearly a division in our society over the issue of systemic racism. And some are claiming that this is a problem within police departments as well as other organizations. Now, President Trump, Attorney General Barr, and some of our leaders, and about a third of U.S. citizens, according to a recent poll, as Dave mentioned, really don't believe that systemic racism is a problem in police organizations. What's really going on, they say, is a few bad apples that, yes, admittedly need to be cleaned up. But there's many other leaders, and about 2/3 of Americans now, who believe that there is systemic racism in police organizations. And just from each of your perspectives, who's right about that?
I think they're
yeah,
both
Ben.
right. I think in the aftermath of one of my social media posts, most recently Sunday, I shared some comments in terms of supporting our law enforcement officers. I know the hearts and the souls of our people here in Wausau. They're great individuals. That doesn't mean that we don't have a lot of work to do in terms of race relations and building a better community together. But one of the comments that was made is that I need to understand the history of law enforcement, and understanding that history of law enforcement will make me understand why people feel that systemic racism exists in law enforcement. And so they shared a podcast through line by NPR called American Policing, and it was shared within the last week or two. So I listened to that. It was about an hour long, and they had a historian and they're talking about law enforcement beginnings in America being slave patrols. And, we enforced overt racism, overtly racist laws like Jim Crow laws, that were meant to keep, the whites and blacks segregated. And that is in our history, and we can't ignore that. I think that's an important thing to know and understand. I think if you look at historical criminal justice outcomes in terms of the number of minorities that end up being imprisoned, there are disparities there. And so are those strictly the fault of law enforcement and boots on the ground that are enforcing the laws? I would argue that they are not, but I wouldn't say that there absolutely has no impact on that. So we need to understand what data exists, how to analyze that data, how we can move forward in a better way so that there aren't disparate outcomes from the criminal justice system.
Thanks, Ben. Jim, from your perspective, do you think there is systemic racism in some of our police organizations in Wisconsin?
I think their implicit bias is prevalent throughout our society, and I think people generally ought to acknowledge and recognize that it is a systemic problem, and it would be, I think, naive to try and say that law enforcement is immune from that. Law enforcement is of particular importance because of the special authority that officers have, and that's why I do think that it is really more of a case of a few bad apples, but law enforcement can't afford to have that many bad apples, and so we really need to do everything that we can to address the issues within policing, the criminal justice system, and at the same time have a broad-based dialogue that is addressed at looking at a systemic set of solutions. I mean, we can enact every policing reform that someone may want, but if we haven't done something to address, for instance, the high proportion of minority children that grow up in poverty, I would assert that we're missing out on an opportunity to affect some meaningful change.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think a lot of people would agree with you that there are a lot of social determinants of behavior, starting with poverty and inequality, lack of education. But unfortunately, we can't get into that today. That's definitely another big topic we would like to address. But let's get back to policing potential reforms. And we're going to talk about specifics in a minute. But before we do that, in your opinion, is there anything that police organizations can do to help restore some of the public confidence that I know we all want to have in the police, that racism isn't a systemic problem within police organizations? What can we do, or what can be done by police organizations?
Well, I'll jump in because I think the Wausau Police Department is just an outstanding example, and they're fortunate to be led by someone of Chief Bliven's caliber, because I think law enforcement agencies and law enforcement associations, frankly, like ours, have to do more in terms of reaching out and engaging in a constructive public dialogue on these issues, so we can inform people and get informed about the perceptions that people have. I mean, it may be the case that the incident like what occurred to George Floyd was rare, statistically speaking, but we also have to recognize that it's an experience that's all too familiar for far too many Americans of color. And so I think in doing more in terms of outreach and in terms of transparency, so that people have an understanding of the circumstances that that lead to a law enforcement officer's decision making. And I think that would go a long way. And I think the Wausau Police Department and not many agencies throughout the state are exemplary in that regard.
Man, I know it's tough because, you know, there's a lot of dialogue. I know you've been through a lot of dialogue processes. You've been through some education, as you just mentioned, through watching some things. But, you know, a lot of people will say, what are the concrete steps, you know, that a police department can do to make a difference and restore confidence? Is there something specific that you think your police department could do?
Yeah, I mean, I'll start talking initially about the things that we have done, that we will continue to be strong in, and first and foremost, you know, policing comes down to the people that you have within your organization. It's no different than a private sector business. You're only as good as the people that you have within your organization. So hiring is critically important. Who you're bringing into your organization, how are you vetting them? What is your process to make sure that you're hiring people of character into your police department? And that is number one, critically important. If you don't have people of character within your department, then you're going to fail in some regard. And so that hiring process is very, very important to be creating and becoming a good police agency. But you can't stop just at hiring. You have to, throughout the career of a law enforcement officer, invest in them in terms of training and education, and making sure that you're talking about things like professionalism, integrity, accountability, respectfulness. Everybody that we engage with in our community is an opportunity to build trust, in a one-on-one relationship with that person. And, you know, most people in our community don't have that many police contacts. So if they only have one police contact and it's not a good one, they're going to tell their friends, they're going to tell their family members, and you're losing trust in your community. So you have to work to make sure that every interaction that you have with your citizens is a positive interaction, and we're following through and doing things in the right way, treating people with compassion and respect. So the other piece of it is, excuse me, is officer wellness. You know, this is a really difficult career. There's a lot of trauma that officers are exposed to on a regular basis. I would argue more so than any other career that might last 25 or 30 years. And so when you experience that much trauma, if you are not giving resources in terms of mental wellness and physical wellness and emotional wellness to your staff and your officers, then we're failing our communities. We're failing our officers. But you don't want to have officers who have been on the job for 15 or 20 years, who are jaded, who are uncompassionate, who initially signed up to serve a community, and now because of the experiences they've had on the job, now they've lost all of that, and they don't treat people in the right way. So, and that's incumbent upon us as communities to make sure that we're investing in the wellness of our police officers at a very high level. And then accountability is critically important too. And it's we have strong accountability practices within our police department. I know that a lot of law enforcement agencies across Wisconsin do as well. And that is, if officers aren't treating people with respect and they're not engaging in professional law enforcement, then they're held accountable and they're disciplined for that behavior. But accountability also cuts both ways. And so if officers are, we get complaints from citizens that are unsubstantiated, that are blatantly untrue. And we need to support officers when those accusations come in. And we need to support them when they're doing great work in our community, because largely that's what they're doing. They're enhancing the quality of life for our entire community. And let's be honest, we live in these communities. We want nothing but to create communities where there aren't drug issues, where there isn't racism, where domestic violence doesn't exist. That's what we work for. That's why we signed up for this job. So that accountability piece is really important. And certainly, like Jim said, we need to be strongly engaged in bringing people together in our communities so that we understand the perspectives, we understand the issues from their viewpoint. And that's something we can always do better. I think we're okay at that here in Wausau, but we can always do a lot better on that.
Eric, I'm going to switch gears here a little bit, but I just noticed that we must have a viewer questions. So Luke, let's go to you and have our first viewer question of the day.
There's a question from Morella. What efforts are occurring to diversify staff? Diversity in all sense of the term, racial, ethnic, and gender, geography. And then they also say, thank you for everyone's time and willingness to be in this virtual space.
Thanks, Marilla. Yeah. Who wants to take that?
I can start with that. Thanks, Marilla. That's a great question that we actually get on a pretty regular basis. And so, if we look at the demographics of our city, obviously we're about 50-50 in terms of male and female. So, but our police department is only about 15% female. So we have 12 female staff out of 80, and so we have a lot of work to do. We're a male-dominated profession. But we do work hard to recruit females into law enforcement profession because that's really important. We have some great female police officers, and in terms of the racial makeup of our police department, we do have minority staff on our police department, 7 of them of various different races. But I would say, going back to what I mentioned just earlier, is that it's important that we hire people for character and we train them for skill. And so we didn't hire, 7 minority staff members just because we wanted to have minority staff members. It's important that we do, no doubt. But we hired them because they were the best people for the job, because they're people of character that will serve our community with integrity. But we do struggle in some regards to recruit minority candidates, specifically African American and Hispanic candidates, to the city of Wausau. And so we've done we've gone to law enforcement recruitment fairs to colleges in Minneapolis and in Chicago and in Madison and Milwaukee to try to reach out to individuals that might want to move to Wausau and work for the police department here. But we've got 0 applicants from the minority community from those recruitment visits. So we need to continue to assess and evaluate those processes.
So Jim, from a statewide perspective outside of Wausau, what are you seeing in terms of recruitment based on Morella's question? And then second, do the unions have any sort of role in this?
In the hiring, we don't. I mean, as a general proposition, we support, the profession and the effort of agencies to have, the demographics of their departments, of their officers, more closely reflect the demographics of the communities they serve. We don't have a significant role, really any role whatsoever in the hiring. But I think, there has been a shift in the last, I'd say, decade here in Wisconsin and across the country, frankly, to improve that dynamic. And we need to do more. We need to, whether it's providing incentives but having more officers, particularly of color, and officers that reflect the demographics of their community is just, it makes for, it helps strengthen the relationship between that agency and the community.
Another issue that's become a big part of the national debate is whether or not there's a systemic problem of excessive police violence and inappropriate use of force. Even after the George Floyd incident on Memorial Day, I'm shocked at the number of incidents we've seen and the amount of footage that's been captured with continued instances of what appears to be police brutality. Why do you think that continues to happen? And even at a time when members of police forces across the country know that there's being additional scrutiny given to the way they do their jobs. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think there's a lot of reasons for that, to be frank, Dave. But at the end of the day, it comes down to, again, character and training of our staff. There's a movement out there, and it's 8 Can't Wait. If you go to 8can'twait.org, there's 8 use of force policies that are recommended by that organization based on research that if law enforcement agencies adopt these policies on use of force, then there's a much less likelihood that use of force will end up in a fatal use of force. And so in Wisconsin, many of the law enforcement agencies in Wisconsin have already adopted those 8 policies, like the stranglehold or the chokehold. making sure that we have a use of force continuum and we train on that. And duty to intervene is a really important piece to that. It's been a really important conversation after George Floyd's death, which is, officers that are on scene need to assess the situation and intervene if an officer is using excessive force or using force inappropriately. And so that's a really important training tool that we use in Wausau. We've adopted all eight of those policies. Some of those are dictated to us through Law Enforcement Standards Board in the state of Wisconsin, which is very strong and progressive. And so we need to train on those things and talk to officers about how to intercede and intervene in a situation where another officer, is behaving unacceptably and using excessive force. And I'll say too that, a lot of these situations that officers go into, where use of force is used are highly charged. And, we are human. So our emotions do get ramped up. We do have adrenaline that comes when we're in a highly charged situation, and we make mistakes sometimes because we are just human. We're people. So, but that's why it's even more important to train so that when we're in those situations, we can help each other handle the situation in the best way possible for the best outcome possible.
Jim, any additional thoughts on that?
No, I agree with everything the chief just said. I think Wisconsin is very representative of many of the reforms that have been discussed on the national level and on the state level. They're already very well represented and long represented here in this state. And I think it's important for us within the law enforcement community to communicate that and explain why that's important. And so no, that's pretty much all I would add to that.
Another thing that's been getting a lot of attention this week are efforts across the country to defund police organizations. Is this something that you're concerned about? And do you see this as a real serious initiative, or do you think it's really part of an attempt to just draw more attention on the need to bring about some significant and meaningful reforms in the way we police in this country?
Well, I think it's clear, law enforcement doesn't like to be painted with a broad brush, and I think it's important to try and avoid doing the same with regard to law enforcement's critics. And the effort of or the interest in defunding the police appears to mean different things to different people. To the extent we're talking about imposing significant reductions on policing, we have seen, for example, LA and Minneapolis that are either abolishing their department or at least talking about that, or have imposed significant reductions in the amount of money that they spend on police services. I think that is a very counterproductive discussion or initiative, at least. Our organization for the last 8 years has conducted a statewide poll through the St. Norbert College Strategic Research Institute. And we started that 8 years ago because as a state police group, we wanted to have a more proactive role in the public dialogue on these issues, as opposed to always being in kind of a responsive posture. And it has benefited us significantly. We've asked questions year in and year out about how people feel about the funding of their police department. And what we've found is that, something in the neighborhood of about 86% of Wisconsinites indicate that they agree that having a well-funded police department, contributes to their quality of life. We've also asked questions about, things like community-oriented policing, that is having police officers work in neighborhoods and communities that develop relationships with the people they serve. And there's a very high approval rating for that particular service here in this state, and by a greater margin when it comes to communities of color. So I mention it within this context because, if you constrict the amount of money or impose, significant funding reductions in police services, it's programs like that that would fall by the wayside. And so it would compromise, programs like community-oriented policing and others that communities of color appear to value the most. And so if anything, we need to invest more money in services like community or efforts like community-oriented policing. In fact, the Wisconsin Attorney General, Josh Call, wrote an editorial this week and in fact calling for just that kind of measure. So we need to build on the strengths generally that we have here in this state, because I believe that Wisconsin is ahead of the curve when compared to its peers throughout the country, and we need to be receptive to where we can, where there's room for improvement.
Chief, have you seen any elements of this debate here locally in Wausau?
Yeah, certainly. And I mean, I agree with everything Jim said. I mean, I think he said it pretty well in regards to, how people in Wisconsin feel about local law enforcement. And I feel like we have tremendous support locally from our community. So I think the defund police movement isn't about just abolishing police departments. It's about evaluating how we go about addressing some of the social issues in our communities. So some of those examples might be, mental health, how we respond to people who are in mental health crisis, how we respond to people that are homeless and chronically homeless in our community, how we respond to people who are, alcohol or drug addicted. And so those are very complex social problems. And it's really difficult for law enforcement to respond to some of those things. So what we've done to respond to those things, because the community is calling us saying, here are the behaviors they're seeing out in the community that are either a nuisance or they're criminal. And so it's our responsibility to respond to those things and try to help the situation, because we're helpers. And so we've done a lot to train our staff in crisis intervention. We've created a crisis assessment response team, which pairs a police officer with a crisis mental health professional, so that when we get calls from the community about somebody who's suicidal or in crisis, we can have a crisis professional there on scene with them, helping a police officer de-escalate and adequately respond to it, to connect people to resources that they critically need. We have a victim resource unit. We have a full-time mental health therapist on staff. She does not treat mental health for police officers. She's strictly focused on mental health of victims of crime in our community. And so, those mental health issues that people experience as a result of criminalization, that can have a long-lasting impact. So we have somebody that's free of charge that they have access to very quickly after they've been victimized. She helps out in response to our domestic violence shelter, sexual assault shelter. She goes into our schools to talk to kids who have been victimized at home. And these are really critical services that we need to provide. But we saw a need for it as a law enforcement agency, so we implemented these programs. But if there's a better way to do it, that we can partner with other services in our community, well, I'm all for that. I think that's a great thing. However, we can best serve the people who are in need of those services in our community. Are we always the best answer? No, I would say definitely not. And law enforcement has been saying that for a long time. That we need other people and other partners in our community to come to the table to address some of these societal issues that we're responding to.
Within the context of this issue, if I could just add, there are those that have suggested that we need to take money away from policing to spend in for social services at the local level and health services and things of that nature. I think, as the Chief Bliven just said, law enforcement would generally agree that there needs to be a greater investment in those areas. But I think it's a false dilemma within this context, because it shouldn't be an either or proposition. If we've learned anything or seen anything from the current pandemic that we're all enduring, is that the government can find the money to support initiatives deemed important. And if we've seen anything over the course of the last 2 weeks, is that this is a fundamental an issue of paramount importance in this country and in this state. And so, it's good to have reforms, and those are important, but they need the appropriate investments need to go along with those so that they can be, carried out effectively.
Thank you. Dave, it looks like we have another question. Luke, could you read that from our audience member?
So I think you gentlemen covered this pretty well, but if there's anything else you wanted to add on, John wanted to know, what strategies do you have to get communities and government to put more resources into issues like mental health, homelessness, and other social factors that too often end up having to be handled by the police?
Yeah. Well, I can add to that, as the state's largest law enforcement group, like many interest groups, when it comes to dealing with public policy, we operate within a fairly narrow silo, if you will, of issues: criminal justice, labor, labor issues related to law enforcement, what have you. I think going forward, for our part, we're going to have to take a greater role in dealing with issues of economic policy, health policy, educational policy, because as we've seen, the problem of racial bias is systemic, and if we're not involved in having a broad discourse on that, and really invested in being a part of the solution to these issues, we have to broaden the scope of what we're willing to engage in and advocate on behalf of. For us to do anything else, I think, makes us complicit in the next tragedy. And so that's something we want to avoid. And hopefully there'll be other groups that will do the same.
And I would advocate to everybody in a community to learn about what resources exist in your own community, and see where the gaps are, because there's gaps in every community. There's just no doubt about that. Last year I was in Madison. The Wisconsin Chiefs of Police Association hosted a legislative advocacy day. We were down there talking to legislators about important issues in law enforcement. And one of our primary focuses was in regards to mental health transports. So when somebody is in crisis and suicidal, they are committed under an emergency detention. And so they go to a place of holding where they get mental health resources, and they're not allowed to leave. And so all across the state of Wisconsin, they're at capacity. So for example, in Wausau, when our local detention center is at capacity, we have to transport people to Winnebago. So there's a 2+ hour drive in the back of a police car to get them the mental health treatment they need. Now consider the fact that we don't have a place here in Wausau where a juvenile can be held inpatient. So every juvenile that is suicidal that needs to get that mental health treatment gets transported across the state in the back of a police car. That's just not trauma informed. That's not something we want to do, but that's the options that we're presented with. Now we're working locally. Hopefully by the end of this year, we will have an inpatient center for juveniles. But that's a problem that exists all over our state. The resources are just not there yet. So that was one of our main priorities as the Wisconsin Chiefs Association in Madison last year. And we haven't seen progress on it yet. So we continue to work locally on those issues. But it's really critical that people that are worried about mental health issues in our community and how law enforcement responds to that. First, I would say that we're way better today than we've ever been. But we need resources. We need people in those systems. We need places where we can take them so they can get the help that they need. And that's just one example of one social issue.
Eric, I just have one follow-up question, and I'll bounce it back to you. But on this issue of funding, so as the debate continues, many have pointed to the disbanding of the Camden, New Jersey Police Department back in 2013, and kind of its recreation as a new kind of an agency as a good example of reform. Do you know much about that, and kind of what's your reaction to what they've done in Camden?
I know a little bit about it. The agency in Camden was riddled with a number of problems, and they did disband it, and it was a collaborative effort over a period of years, I believe. I know it is being held out as an example of how perhaps law enforcement should be reimagined, but I think many of the things that are being done by that Camden Police Agency today are already well represented in the agencies throughout the state of Wisconsin. So I think we need to have that public discourse and talk about that. And, as we continue to engage others and some of the advocates for these initiatives, to find out what exactly is it that they want to accomplish. And then let's talk about whether there are gaps that we can fill here in the state.
Great.
Okay, thank you. At the moment, there's a lot of bipartisan support for police reform at the national level, and how that might trickle down or be affected at the local level is still a lot of questions around. But, the House controlled by the Democrats, has proposed a new bill. The Senate has organized, controlled by the Republicans, organized a task force that's looking into this. Now, there are definitely some specific things that they're looking at. And so I want to kind of go over a couple of these to get your reaction, frankly, to what you feel is appropriate or not. So, for example, one of the ideas is banning chokeholds. What do you think about that? Would you support that? Would you be against that?
To speak for our organization, we would support that. In the law enforcement curriculum that governs all law enforcement training and education here in Wisconsin, chokeholds are not taught, and in fact, the actions like those of the officer in Minneapolis, Darren Chauvin, are specifically, officers and candidates, in pursuing the profession, are specifically taught not to do that. So on that issue, we would have no problem with banning them outright.
Any additional comment, Ben? It's okay if you don't.
No, I agree 100% with Jim.
Okay, let's move on to a national database that could track police misconduct. How do you feel about that? We
support that. We already have a similar system that's here in Wisconsin that's maintained by the State Department of Justice. So it helps prevent the ability of an officer to float from one agency to another and shield a troubled personnel history. So we support that.
Yeah, I think, we have that system in place in Wisconsin. If anybody who leaves employment as a sworn law enforcement officer, their agency has to report to the state the reasons they left. So, for example, if somebody retires, obviously we say they retired. If they resign because they're moving on to a different career, that's what we say. But then there's other pieces of it, like, did they resign in lieu of termination? Did they resign under investigation? And so if they try to get another job in law enforcement, it should be incumbent upon that law enforcement agency who's received that application to reach out to their prior employer and find out why they left that agency and what kind of an officer they were, and to see if there were any red flags in their background. That should absolutely be something that every law enforcement agency in the country should be doing.
So just a quick follow-up. Oh, sorry, Jim, go ahead.
No, I was just going to add, I think it's important to note that, nobody wants a bad officer out of the profession more than a good one. And the vast majority of officers in Wisconsin and throughout the country are good officers. And, there is a perception that police unions protect bad apples. I can tell you from our experience, we don't view our role that way. There are officers that, we encounter that don't belong in the profession. And we have to be responsive to that. So we think accountability on, whether it's through a system like this, a registry, or through other mechanisms, is important to have.
So following up on that registry question, Ben, it sounded like you and Jim that there is definitely some system in place so that when an officer leaves, the reasons have to be revealed. What about the officer, like, let's, heaven forbid, we should have another one like Derek Chauvin, who had a lot of issues going on clearly before he was ever asked to leave, and frankly was never asked to leave. Is there some transparency needed, or do we have that transparency for current officers so we know, like, who's racking up these kind of complaints or these kind of issues?
I feel like we by and large have that in Wisconsin. I know there has been some discussion surrounding the collective bargaining agreement, the contract that the Minneapolis police union has with that city, and there are provisions in there that shield some of those records and require that they be destroyed in certain circumstances. That is not the case here in this state, and that's an important distinction to draw. We think accountability is important. We've supported legislative efforts to increase the transparency in the hiring process, and we're going to continue to do so.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I think.
Yeah,
go ahead.
No, go ahead, Ben.
I was just going to just dovetail on that. That the transparency piece is really important. That law enforcement agencies can talk amongst each other, frankly, about what type of officer the person was. If we had an officer leave our agency and move to an agency on the west side of the state. So when I talked to the chief from that department, I told him exactly what I thought of this officer, and he's a really good officer, a really good person, did his job, and very respectful. And so I was very frank with that chief. We've had sworn staff here that have left under not less than ideal circumstances, and again, the same thing is true. Like in terms of transparency and other hiring processes, when I get a call, I'm very frank about what issues we had with that officer, and I think that's important. We owe it to each other because, exactly to Jim's point, nobody wants a bad police officer, bad person in that uniform wearing that badge, because it makes our job more difficult, and it makes us less safe because people trust us less. So it's critically important that we do that in the right way.
And Darren Chauvin perhaps provides the best evidence of exactly the point that Chief Bliven just said. That's common with and it's a little bit unique to the law enforcement profession, that an officer in another state, anywhere in the country, can engage in something that's controversial or engage in misconduct, and it is attributed to officers generally. And so that's why it's so important for everyone within the law enforcement community to promote the professionalism and the training and the standards that people expect.
So we could go on with a long list. I'll just conclude with one more, and this might be a little tough, but this idea of scaling back liability shields for police officers in civil and criminal court. How do you feel about that? I mean, one argument is if we're training them up appropriately and vetting them appropriately, then we shouldn't have to, hide from or shield them from prosecution if they're doing bad things.
Go ahead.
Go ahead, no, Joe.
Chief, go ahead.
Ben, why don't you start, and then we'll go to Jim.
Oh.
Ben,
I think in terms of the criminal liability, I don't think there's any police department or officer that would have any concerns about. We should be charging police officers if they're engaging in criminal behavior. That's a no-brainer, easy decision. I get the fact that there is concern around how quickly sometimes that happens, or rather how slowly sometimes that happens in these cases. And that's something we can work on and work toward to doing in a better way. But, if an officer's behaving criminally, they need to be held accountable and they need to be criminally charged. No different than, if an officer is, engaged in gets in a traffic crash and, they violated a traffic statute, they should be issued a citation no different than a citizen. Right. So, I agree with that. In terms of the civil liability, I think it's really important that we're really thoughtful about that, because that can impact our ability to hire and to retain police officers. And so we need to be thoughtful about that. If there's a police officer acting outside the scope of their employment while they're working, and they violate civil rights of somebody, then they should be held civilly liable. Right. But I just think we need to be cautious about how we go about that, and be thoughtful about it.
Jim, did you have a follow-up? It's okay. If you
Chief Bliven said it very well. I very little I can add to that. I think it is important to be thoughtful about it. There are some concerns that we have relative to the provision that's included in the House bill, because it would basically hold officers accountable from a civil perspective, regardless of whether or not the law was clear about what they were doing, whether it was lawful. And so, officers, if they, again, act outside the scope of their employment, they act wrongfully, they should be held accountable. But we don't want, the pendulum ought not swing too far the other way, because for all the reasons Chief Bliven just said, and it will, devastate what is already a problem throughout Wisconsin and throughout the country, and that is recruiting people into this profession.
We're kind of, wow, this hour has really flown by. Dave, I'm going to let you have the last question to choose which question you'd like to ask our guests, and then we'll conclude at that point. So just want to give you that heads up.
Yeah, I just maybe I'll ask an open-ended question. Is there anything else of importance that we haven't talked about that both of you think it's important for our viewers to understand about law enforcement and policing that might be getting lost in the heat of the debate that's going on right now? Anything that we missed along the way?
I'll try to be relatively quick. But I think one important thing for people to know about law enforcement is that every law enforcement agency in our country is different. We have the same underlying responsibilities to enforce laws and arrest criminals and investigate crimes. But we all have different histories of mayors and city councils and city ordinances. We have different beliefs about accountability. We have different philosophy of law enforcement. Leadership is different. So every law enforcement agency is different. And so I think it's really important that communities recognize that, communities get engaged, talk to your elected officials, talk to your chief of police or your sheriff, get to know what your local police department does in all of these different situations. What type of law enforcement philosophy do they have? So I think those are really critical things. And I'll just end with that. I will go to my grave supporting law enforcement. I have seen the unbelievable work that our law enforcement officers do every single day they come here, and they're serving our community in a tremendous way. They're making a positive impact in the quality of life of people here, and they have great hearts and they're good people. And I will go to my grave believing that. I will also go to my grave knowing that we can always do better, and we always should be striving to get better. So I appreciate law enforcement, but I know that we can do better.
Thanks, Jim.
I think the chief said it very well. The only thing I would add really is to reiterate that, the issue of racial bias and prejudice in our country is systemic. And hopefully we can transition to a place where we're not there yet, where we're having a broad-based dialogue that includes the voice of law enforcement, that is really focused on identifying a systemic set of solutions. And I think if we can do that, Wisconsin, for instance, in 2014 was the first state in the nation to mandate the independent investigations of officer-involved deaths. And that was a significant police reform. I think one of only 3 or 4 states in the country currently have such a law. And that was a result of law enforcement working with citizen advocates, including, the parents of individuals that had been shot and killed by police officers. Those perhaps opposing interests or opposing points of view coming together to work for a common goal. I think we can do that again. That gives me some sense of optimism. And hopefully we transition, the discourse in this state and in this country transitions to that point.
Wow. Thank you so much. We're out of time. Discussing this issue has been not only enlightening, but, it's appreciated that you're willing to do it in a public way. So we appreciate you being here. And despite the challenges, I do believe, as you were saying, that most people and most people I talk with recognize that the vast majority of men and women who serve as police officers are committed to serving and protecting their communities. I think we all know it's a difficult job. Everybody knows that, and an increasingly thankless one. So we thank you for trying to be part of the solution. So thank you.
I'd like to echo that appreciation as well, and thank you for being on our show today. Next week, we're going to be focusing on the state of small business in Wisconsin, how small businesses are coping in this COVID-19 environment that we're in these days, and what kind of policies and resources exist to support small business. We're going to be pleased to welcome our special guest, the Executive Director of the Wisconsin Hmong Chamber of Commerce, as well as the District Director of the U.S. Small Business Administration. So please join us next week. And thank you, Eric, for another great job today.
Yeah, thank you, Dave. Thanks to our guests. And I just want our viewers to know that we'll be bringing back the bald puns next week. So beware. We almost couldn't resist with Jim being the third bald guy, but we do appreciate you being here. So we'll see you next week.
Thank you.